talk about what is really both a very interesting topic, right? I mean, money, but also very important in the sense that our attitudes about money and wealth, not only individually but collectively, have really important implications economically, socially, politically, and ecologically, of course. The topic, Buddhism and wealth, Buddhism and money. So the first thing we have to ask is, which Buddhism? This is something you have to do to sort of establish your academic credentials, right? To make sure. I'm as guilty as anyone talking in very general terms. Buddhism says this, or Buddhism asserts that. But of course, as scholars, we know that when we just start to look at the tradition, we realize that there is no one tradition, that it's really a cluster of related traditions, which actually often disagree with each other in a number of ways. So we have not only the original teachings of the Buddha, which we have no direct access to, and the Pali Canon, which is probably as close as we can get, but we also have the Theravada commentaries and understanding of that tradition, those texts, and then later on Mahayana, different schools like Madhyamaka, Yogacara, and then different types of Buddhism that developed when Buddhism spread to different cultures, like China. My own practice tradition, Chan or Zen, came out of the interaction between Buddhism and Chinese culture, especially Taoism, Tibetan Buddhism, and so forth. So there's a great variety of different understandings of Buddhist teaching and Buddhist practice. So there's this big question, if we're going to talk about Buddhism, which Buddhism are we going to talk about? And what I was happy to discover, though, as I looked into the issue and sort of poked around a little bit, was to see that actually, regarding this particular issue, attitudes towards wealth and money, I couldn't find any significant differences between the different traditions. I didn't notice any significant arguments regarding wealth and money. I'm sure there are people here who can correct me if I've overlooked something important. But what this means is that, for the sake of this talk, we can go back to the earliest text we have, the Pali Canon, and we'll sort of rely on what Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, is understood to have said in that. So that's what I'm going to refer to for the sake of the Buddhist side. I'm not going to be talking about other types of Buddhism. I'll be pretty well focusing on what we find in the Pali Canon. And what do we find there? From the very beginning, there's a very interesting tension that develops between two very different understandings of wealth. From the very beginning, we find two very different approaches, understandings of wealth that are actually very different from each other and yet depend upon each other. And this is a tension that not only continues, but it solidifies and becomes institutionalized as Buddhism develops. And as far as I can see, it survives until today. On the one side, what we have is the example, the sort of primordial or originary story of the Buddha himself. And his example, his attitude toward wealth. Because according to the myth, and it is largely a myth, he came from a very wealthy, powerful family. His father was a king, and he was understood to have had virtually everything he wanted, everything that wealth could provide, including, wife and son. And yet, at a certain point, when he realized that when he encountered an old man, an ill man, and then finally a dead man, that is to say a corpse, he realized that his wealth didn't really give him an answer to that challenge. And so according to the story, right, he abandoned his home, went off into the forest, studied with a couple different teachers, engaged in ascetic practices, later meditated, and came to this great awakening under a tree, and ended up founding a sangha that, like him, lived very, very simply, with virtually nothing in the way of wealth. And this was kind of built into their lifestyle. by modern standards, we would say they were living in quite an impoverished way. At the time, they were actually criticized for being a little self-indulgent because they actually ate one meal a day. But by our standards, they were certainly living a very simple lifestyle. So that's on the one hand, the Sangha that he establishes that lives in the same way as him. This Sangha, they basically survive as mendicants. That is to say, they beg. They have nothing of their own. They have no families. They don't engage in any kind of productive labor. Certainly on the wealth side, they live very, very simply. And yet, here's the catch. In order for them to live without working, without doing anything productive economically, what happens is that they end up being dependent on being supported by people who have some kind of economic surplus. That is to say, from the very beginning, it seems like there was quite a bit of dependence both on royalty, kings, and also on the burgeoning merchant class or middle class of the time. Also some sort of village support, but that actually, evidently, as far as we can tell, took some time to develop. Originally, it was those who had a significant surplus that they could share with the Sangha members. And so because the Sangha was, even for its own very simple, relatively poor lifestyle, because it was dependent on these donations, the support from the wealthy, you end up with two very different understandings, two very different approaches to the value of wealth. On the one hand, for the monks and the nuns, for the bhikkhu and the bhikkhuni, the idea is very much you should live as simply as possible. You don't want to be diverted, distracted from following the path with lots of meditation and so forth. But on the other side, in order to be supported, there's a great advantage in having lay supporters who have quite a bit of excess wealth that they can share with the Sangha. And this is the kind of tension that we find from the very beginning and keeps carrying through. Probably maybe the most famous of the Buddha's lay supporters, Anathapindika, was also a multimillionaire, if not a billionaire, by contemporary standards. He was considered the most important of the lay supporters because perhaps, I think very likely, he was the one who actually gave the most to the Sangha. For example, he was the one who donated the Jeta Grove, very important retreat center, to the Sangha. Unfortunately, Prince Jeta didn't want to sell it. And according to the legend, in order to buy it, he had to cover the land with gold coins. According to the myth, 1.8 million gold coins. And that was how he was able to actually get the land and then be able to donate it to the Sangha. Anathapindika, actually, it's not his original name. It was a title, right? What is it called? He is the feeder of the orphans and helpless. And this also is very important. Unlike the idea that you find in the Gospels, you remember the story that Jesus says where it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. That's cool. In the case of Anathapindika, though, as this great supporter, presumably someone who was making some effort to follow the path in other ways as well, it's believed that when he died, he went up to Tusita heaven, and presumably from there attained nirvana. So again, there's this sense that the wealth of Anathapindika, especially if it's used in a good way to support the Sangha, is something extremely valuable. It's not something that the Buddhist tradition wants or can critique. As the Buddhist Sangha developed, this split actually became more important. Because originally, the Sangha was understood to include laymen and laywomen, as well as bhikkhu nuns and bhikkhuni nuns. Bhikkhu monks and bhikkhuni nuns. But over time, what happened was, it was generally accepted that it was really only the monastics who had much chance of making great developments and achieve some kind of awakening. And so the primary role of the lay people was to follow the precepts and therefore and also to support the Sangha by making dana, by making donations. And from my perspective, it's kind of sad to see the way that, if you look at the Pali Canon, the very nuanced, sophisticated way that the Buddha seems to have understood karma becomes reduced to something quite one-dimensional. It becomes reduced to what we now know as punya, that is to say, merit-making. And it's understood in a kind of one-dimensional way. It's almost like a kind of spiritual materialism. It's when you offer things, especially to the Sangha, to the monks, in a way you are gaining spiritual merit in your sort of heavenly bank account, which can lead to a better rebirth in your future lifetime, or if you're lucky, you might be able to win the lottery this lifetime. I suspect there's a very interesting book, maybe a PhD dissertation, to be written comparing what happened to punya, or comparing what happened to the karma doctrine, and the way that that became commodified into punya, this sort of spiritual bank, and the way that sin became commodified in the Middle Ages. In the case of sin, originally, in the early Middle Ages, it seems to have been understood in a kind of sort of general sense of alienation from God. But then later on, with the Papal Revolution of the 11th century, sin became part of a very complex legal system that the Church administered, which ended up, of course, with the kind of indulgences that Luther revolted against. The idea that you can buy letters of indulgence from the Church that will help Grandpa to get out of purgatory in a shorter period of time. Whereas in the case of Buddhism, what happened was not only did you have a punya as something you accumulate, but also how much merit you accumulate depends not only on what you give, but who you give it to. Which implies, of course, that it's always better to give to a monk, say give food to a monk, no matter how well fed he may always be, than it would be to give to a starving homeless person. Because obviously the monk, being a monk, it has a higher spiritual status than that homeless person who must have very bad karma. In other words, in both cases, what seems to have happened is this system became commodified in a way that worked, of course, to the benefit of the religious institution. And something, unfortunately, that still largely continues, as you'll see if you go to somewhere like Thailand or South Asia. Whether we look at the monastic attitude toward their own wealth or the attitude of Buddhism toward lay people, in neither case is poverty acceptable, because poverty involves dukkha. Maybe I can do a reality check here. How many of you are familiar with the term dukkha? Okay, quite a few. That's the term usually translated as suffering. For example, in the Four Noble Truths, suffering causes suffering, end of suffering, path to end suffering. But it only works if you understand it in the broadest possible sense. Not only mental and physical pain, but dissatisfaction, frustration, anxiety, dis-ease. It really refers to our inability to be very happy for very long, at least for most of us. We normally think of, we normally think that if we just manage to get everything that we need, if we can solve all our problems and acquire all the things that we would like to have, then we would be happy. But I think the claim of dukkha is something quite different. The implication is that it's something about the nature of our own minds, such that even if we don't have a problem, somehow our minds are going to create one. But certainly in the case of material poverty, that would be an example of dukkha. So since Buddhism is a worldview and a practice that emphasizes eliminating our dukkha, Buddhism can't and hasn't ever valued poverty in itself. That's a source of dukkha. In fact, I'm not aware, I haven't been able to find any text in the Pali Canon in which poverty is encouraged for lay people. On the contrary, the Buddha says, quote, "For householders in this world, poverty is suffering. Woeful in the world is poverty and debt." Both of those quotations from the Pali Canon. So Buddhism, as we would expect, values non-attachment toward material goods, and it promotes the value of having fewer wants, fewer desires, but that's not, of course, the same thing as encouraging poverty. Buddhism recognizes the importance of sort of basic minimum needs, even in the case of those like the monastics who aspire to the spiritual goal of awakening. And in fact, you could say this provides the kind of, how to say it, level of subsistence beyond which human beings in general shouldn't be allowed to fall. So we have what's called in Buddhism the four requisites that monks as well as monastics as well as lay people need. Number one, food sufficient to alleviate hunger and maintain health. Clothing, enough clothing to be socially decent and to protect the body. Shelter sufficient for serious engagement with cultivating the mind. And finally, health care to avoid and to cure and to prevent illness. And for the monastics, of course, people who voluntarily renounce anything more than this, they are looked upon in a very positive way as belonging to the community of noble ones. But to say it again, this community of noble ones, because it's not engaged in any kind of productive work, is dependent on the surplus, the excess wealth provided by those in the society who do value making money and accumulating wealth. And Buddhism approves of that, provided that the wealth is used in the right way, which coincidentally means a lot of it supporting the Buddhist Sangha. There are many passages in the Nikayas, that is to say the early texts, that exhort lay people to seek and gain and use wealth in rightful ways, because that's considered one of the good results of good karma. In fact, the Buddha speaks of the four kinds of happiness attained by householders. First of all, possessing enough material resources, enjoying them, sharing those resources with relations and friends, and in not being in debt. So he talks of these as four types of happiness. Again, we should emphasize and not pass over the sharing. Sharing one's wealth. Bhoga sukha, very important. So what we can see in Buddhism is that it's not either or, but in a way, both and. The Buddha said that some people are like the completely blind. They don't have the vision to improve their material circumstances or lead a morally elevated life. Others are like the one-eyed. They have the vision to improve their material situation, but they don't see the need to live a morally elevated life. And then he says the third class, again, these are lay people, they have the vision to improve both. Such Buddhist teachings imply that when evaluating wealth, it's not enough just to consider material conditions. And again, this is quite striking. It also reminds us that the etymology, the origin of our English word wealth, comes from the Old English weal, which means more generally well-being. Not just material well-being, but well-being in general. So for Buddhism, someone who gains riches by diligent application and puts it to good use is said to be victorious, both in this world and in the next. But even more important, the Buddha emphasizes, is the happiness of leading a blameless life, because as he says, the greatest wealth is containment. The greatest wealth is contentment. In fact, in one passage he mentions seven different types of noble wealth, none of which involve money. These are, and again, he's speaking to lay people. Right? The 7 types of noble wealth are 1, faith, moral conduct, the shame of doing something reprehensible, I guess the shame that keeps you from doing the fear of doing something reprehensible, developing your character, sacrificing your possessions for the benefit of others, and insight into the three marks, the three characteristics of existence, that is to say, suffering, impermanence, and not self. So what can we draw from this? There does seem to be a kind of ambivalence, or is it maybe just that we're talking about different stations and we can't really put them lumped together into one type of station, right? Buddhism does emphasize that when we gain an intense acquisitive drive for some object, that becomes a cause of suffering. One of the metaphors that's used is protecting the flame of a small torch against the wind. How difficult that is, how little light there may be because we're having to protect it, to keep it from being blown out. In other words, he says it involves a lot of anxiety, but not much satisfaction. So for Buddhism, this proliferation of unnecessary wants is a basic cause of dukkha, of ill-being. So, and yet this isn't a criticism of wealth per se, but an implicit critique of individuals, and I think we could generalize an implicit critique of a society as well that becomes too preoccupied with money-making and consumerism. So what Buddhism emphasizes is wealth is good if you pursue it in the right way, if you don't hoard it, and if you spend it in the right way. Again, speaking of the situation of lay people. As far as making it in the right way, the Buddha talks about the fifth part of the Eightfold Path, right? There's four things that it's really important to avoid when we're making money. We shouldn't deal in the sale of harmful weapons or poisons. We shouldn't deal in the slaughter or the flesh of animals. We shouldn't buy or sell alcohol. And likewise, human beings, that is to say, get involved in slavery or prostitution. When it comes to hoarding wealth, there's a fantastic story in the Pali Canon where King Pasenadi of Kosala, one of the main kings of the time, actually comes to the Buddha and says he's just been busy confiscating the hoard of wealth by an old miser who didn't have any descendants, and so the state sort of took over what the wealth was left. And King Pasenadi describes 8 million gold coins, innumerable silver coins, and so forth. And yet, when this old miser was living, he lived on broken rice and vinegar, dressed in coarse cloth sewn together, used a broken down chariot for transport, and shaded himself with leaves. And the Buddha says something interesting here, right? That's how it is, Your Majesty. The foolish man obtaining these fine requisites, he doesn't support himself or his family or his servants or employees in comfort. He doesn't make offerings to religious mendicants. His wealth, accumulated and not used, disappears to no purpose. His wealth is like a forest pool, clear, cool, and fresh, with good approaches and shady settings, but it's in a forest full of ogres. In other words, it's beautiful wealth, but no one can get there, no one can use it. And the Buddha contrasts that with the man who knows how to use his wealth wisely. That is to say, in this case, the wise man's wealth is like a forest pool, not far from the village, with cool, clear, fresh water, good approaches, and so forth. People can freely drink of that water, carry it away, bathe in it, use it as they please. And then he says, Your Majesty, those people who have obtained vast wealth, who are not intoxicated by it, who don't become heedless and recklessly indulgent in a way that endangers others, they are very rare in this world. But he's not criticizing the wealth itself, or even, strictly speaking, the desire to become wealthy. It seems to me there's a shorter way to describe all that. Right? Wealth is like manure. If you spread it around, it can do a lot of good. But if you pile it up in one place, it stinks to high. I think that's the critique of the miser. Prapayutta, maybe the most distinguished monk in the Thai tradition, I think, describes this attitude well toward wealth. He says, quote, "A life that's free, one that's not overly reliant on material things, is a life that's not deluded by them. This demands a clear knowledge of the benefits and limitations of material possessions. Without this wisdom, we invest all our happiness in material things, even though they can never lead to higher qualities of mind. And in fact, as long as we remain attached to them, they hinder our peace of mind, because by their very nature, they lack the ability to completely satisfy us. They're impermanent, unstable, ultimately can't be controlled, and must inevitably go to dissolution. So when we cling to them, we suffer needlessly. When we were born, they weren't born with us, and when we die, we can't take them along." And then he contrasts that, again, the wealthy person, whose wisdom involves detachment, who is neither enslaved by them nor carries them as a burden, who can live cheerfully, unconfused, without being spoiled by them. In my own Zen practice, I was very fortunate in that my two main teachers, Robert Aitken in Hawaii and Yamada Koen Roshi in Japan, both of them were fairly wealthy people. Robert Aitken married into wealth with his second wife. And Yamada Roshi, very successful businessman, his wife, a doctor. So they both had quite a bit of money, and yet it was remarkable. I never sensed any attachment or how that they abused this. On the contrary, I was one of the many, many, many beneficiaries of their largesse, in the sense that they didn't need to teach or get any money or anything from their teaching. They were able to make that available freely. For people like me, at the time, a kind of basically impoverished hippie, and it made it possible for me to practice, not having to worry about, as is sometimes the case nowadays. I meet people who want to go to retreats and can't afford them often because they've become quite expensive. I remember when I first was invited to live in the Maui Zendo, I said, "Sorry, Bob, I don't have any money, sorry." He said, "No, don't worry about it, it's $35 a week. Sorry, $35 a month, room and board, including retreats. And if you don't have the money, I'll lend it to you, and you can pay me back sometime." So I have to say, I'm much inspired by their example. Again, I can think of a very simple way to summarize a lot of what Buddhism is getting at here. Right? Money is a terrible master, but a wonderful servant. And those two Zen teachers really exemplified that for me. So to conclude this first part, in the Sigalaka Sutta, again from the earliest text, the Buddha says, "The wise man trained and disciplined shines out like a beacon, gathering wealth just like the bee gathers honey, and it grows like an anthill higher and higher. With wealth so gained, the layman can devote it to the people's good." And then he says, interesting, that this layperson should divide his money into 4 parts. Excuse my use of the male pronoun, but this is, of course, the focus of the original text too, right? So one part should be enjoyed at will. Quite striking. The Buddha is emphasizing wealth is to be enjoyed for lay people. If you got money, enjoy it. 1/4. 2/4, you use it, you invest it in your business, and then you put 1/4 aside for resources in case of emergencies or some kind of needy situation arising. So what do we have? Do we have a kind of middle way? Well, maybe, but it's kind of odd in the sense that I've been talking mostly about the lay people, and yet we do have these two attitudes. It's not as though we individually or collectively should sort of hover somewhere in the middle between the monastic and the lay. We seem to have two different wings, both of which are necessary in order for the Buddhist tradition to flourish, or I guess in this case, for the Buddhist tradition to fly, right? On the one hand, you need serious practitioners who aren't at all preoccupied with money or enjoying themselves. And yet, on the other side, you need people who have wealth sufficient to support. And of course, what I've said so far, I think, makes a lot of common sense. In fact, you don't have to be a Buddhist to be sort of thinking that there's a lot of value in this way, right? We need both eyes to be open. Wealth is good if it's pursued and gained in the right way and used rightly. A kind of conventional understanding and even a predictable critique of greed. Very fine as far as it goes, and yet I can't help wondering, is there something else in the Buddhist tradition that we can turn to that can maybe give us some other, maybe even some deeper insights into what Buddhism implies, especially trying to apply it to our particular economic situation today. I mean, Buddhism isn't only, or I would say even primarily, a tradition that focuses on moral precepts, or even focuses primarily on the issue of greed. In this way, I would compare, or rather contrast Buddhism to, say, the Abrahamic traditions, which we call ethical monotheism, because that's God's main way of relating to us and our main way of relating to Him, right? He tells us how to live, and we have this responsibility to live according to that. For Buddhism, the primary axis isn't this good, evil, good, bad. Rather, the primary axis is more along the lines of delusion, wisdom, or let's say ignorance and awakening. And from this perspective, we may wonder, is there something deeper here in the Buddhist tradition that we can extract? The Buddha himself says in one of the really important suttas, the Brahmajala Sutta, that people are going to praise me for the wrong thing. They're going to praise me for trifling matters like mere morality. And they're going to miss what I've really discovered, the profound things that I've realized. So, for example, he doesn't simply talk about greed, but he has a lot to say about what are often called the three fires, or the three poisons, or the three unwholesome roots. That is to say, greed, ill will, and delusion. And it's worthwhile just spending a word here on this, because this, I think, also gives us a lot of insight into the Buddha's particular way, his real contribution, I would say his revolutionary contribution to how we understand karma and how karma works. At the time of the Buddha, karma was already something that was generally believed, and yet it was often understood in a kind of mechanistic way. In other words, if you hired a Brahmin to perform a ritual for you, and he performed it in the right way, then you would get what you were sacrificing for. It would just sort of come sooner or later. It might be delayed, or if there was a mistake, something would maybe not happen. But basically, this is the way it was understood. And what the Buddha really added, which I think is so important, and I think many Buddhists today still misunderstand, is the emphasis on motivation or intentionality. He said, what really creates karma is the attitude of mind with which we do something. That if we're motivated by greed, ill will, delusion, these three poisons, these three fires, then we're going to find ourselves in situations that are very problematical. We're going to create dukkha, not only for ourselves, but probably for other people as well. Whereas if we turn that around, if we're motivated by generosity, loving kindness, wisdom, then we're going to find ourselves in different sorts of situations. And I think there's something really profound here, that you don't have to believe in karma as something cosmological or something that takes place after you die. I think we can see the wisdom in this. Karma here, then, is really, the Buddha is pointing to, I think, the kind of golden key to transform the quality of our lives. He's saying something like, if you want to change the way that you experience the world, and the way that other people experience and respond to you, there's a very simple way to do that. Not necessarily easy, but the basic principle is simply this: transform your motivations. That's what the Buddha is. That's what the Buddha is focusing on. And I think we can get a sense of that when we're motivated in a way that is, what can I get out of this situation? Then we're going to tend to dualize more, and we can see how people are going to respond to us in a very different way than if our primary motivations are generosity and and loving kindness, acting out of the realization, that we're not separate from each other, that I can't really distinguish my well-being completely from your well-being. In that case, we can open up, we can relax, we can be transparent. And that's going to have certain implications as far as how people experience us and how they're going to respond to us. So I think there's something very profound here, whether or not we want to understand karma cosmologically or not. But if we focus on the delusion sort, if we focus on the delusion side of things, we can also see something special about the nature of wealth. That wealth is one half of a dualistic pair, or one half of a binary pair. By binary pair, I mean things like hot, cold, big, small, tall, short, light, dark. In other words, it seems like we have two concepts, but if you think about it, you realize there's really not two concepts at all. They're actually two sides of the same coin. If you don't know what hot means, you don't really know what cold means, right? So you can't have one without the other. They always go together. Now that's a logical point, but it can also be psychologically very powerful as well. The fact that you can't have one without the other. For example, supposing you want to live a pure life. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're going to be preoccupied with impurity. However you understand purity. You're going to be preoccupied with avoiding impurity. Because the whole concept of purity depends upon the concept, it's the negation, it's the other side of impurity. Right? The same thing with good and evil. That's another important binary pair, which I think has had enormous implications throughout history, because it means that we don't know what's good until we know what's evil. And we can't feel that we are good unless we are fighting against the evil. That goes a long way to explaining a lot of the gruesome history of things like heresy trials and inquisitions, and even, I would say, the war on terror, to be more recent, given that what's the real difference between what Bin Laden and George W. Bush were doing? They were both fighting the same holy war. They reversed it. What the one thought was good, the other thought was evil, but basically they both understood themselves to be good, fighting against evil. And what it means to be good, of course, is that you are struggling against the evil and trying to destroy it. Leading to the tragic irony, of course, that one of the main causes of evil in this world has been our attempts to destroy evil. But of course, the bipolar pair or dualistic concepts that apply right now is this whole issue of wealth and poverty. We only understand wealth as the negation of poverty and vice versa. What that means, of course, is that if, for example, the most important thing for you is becoming wealthy, your desire for wealth is going to be the other side, exactly equal to your fear or your discomfort about the possibility of being poor. You've got to take both spectacles. You can't have one without the other. We're talking about a particular kind of way of thinking, of the world view, that you have to take both of them at the same time. In this way, as we say in Zen, we bind ourselves without a rope. We see the world in these terms, and then we get trapped up trying to get the one and not realizing that you're going to be preoccupied with both. The Duchess of Windsor, for example, said famously that you can never be too thin or too poor. Sorry, oh, that's wrong. Never be too thin or too rich, right? Again, that's another example of dualistic thinking, because what it implies, of course, is that all of us are always too fat and too poor, right? And yet we know that's not true, too, in the sense that it is possible to be too thin, as many adolescent girls have discovered to their own misfortune. And likewise, it's possible to be too preoccupied with this desire for wealth, to be so caught up in this need to have more and more. Johnny Carson, the talk show host, once said, "The only thing money gives you is the freedom of not worrying about money." That's very nicely put, especially the word freedom. It doesn't guarantee that you'll not worry about money, but it gives you that option. But it's very interesting, of course, is that that's not always the way it works. That often it's the people who have a lot of money who are the most concerned, who are the most worried about money, not only preserving what they have, but making more money, right? And here's the really interesting question. Why is it that we as human beings are so susceptible to this way of thinking? This way of thinking, I'm referring to this kind of compulsive or addictive quality that we somehow define the meaning of our lives in terms of how much money we can accumulate. And here what I'd like to do is step back a moment and try to understand this in the broader context of what I think is the single most important teaching of Buddhism. By which I mean the connection that the Buddhist tradition makes between dukkha, suffering in the broadest sense, and anatta, this sense of a separate self. Anatta is maybe the second most important term in the Buddhist tradition. This very strange, counterintuitive claim that the self isn't real. In contemporary terms, I think we have something that allows us to understand what the Buddha was probably getting at here. That is to say, thanks to 20th century developmental psychology, we can see how the sense of self is something psychologically and socially conditioned, right? A baby isn't born with the sense of self, it develops over time. It's a psychological construct, that's the important thing, that develops. It's psychological because it involves learning to think in a certain way, the construction of a self-image, and certain habitual ways of thinking, feeling, acting, reacting, planning, tending, remembering, and so forth, working together to be preoccupied with this self-image and to sustain it and to promote its well-being in some way. It's also a social construct because in order for this sense of self to develop, you need other selves, usually a caregiver, a mother, that somehow young children internalize and they learn to see themselves in the same way. But here's the really interesting point. The Buddha emphasizes the connection between the delusion of separate self and suffering. What Buddhism seems to be saying is that this really gets at the root of our suffering. This is the fundamental problem for us, that we have this sense of a separate self. And I think if we understand it as a construct, I think we can begin to make sense of what's going on here. That if the sense of self is a construct, there's nothing inherently real or substantial about it. That is to say, it's simply a confluence of processes. It's how these habitual processes, mostly mental, emotional processes work together. But there's nothing real there behind it. Which means the sense of self, being a construct, is inherently uncomfortable, inherently ungrounded. Not only ungrounded, but ungroundable, that it can never make itself comfortable. The sense of self, being insubstantial, is inherently insecure. And I think that's what the Buddha is pointing to. One way to say it, and I think this is how we often experience it. If this is true, we have to experience it. And I think we do experience it in the sense that the way it comes out is what we have is this feeling. And I think this is one of the great secrets of life. I think it's a feeling that we all have, and yet we don't realize that everyone else has it. It's the feeling deep inside that something is wrong with me. Something isn't quite right. Something is missing. I mean, I can look at all of you out there, and you look quite substantial. I can see you're all real, but from the inside, something doesn't feel quite right. And so what we have is this sense of lack. one way to say it is that the sense of a separate self, the feeling that there's a me inside separate from the rest of the world outside, this sense of duality, separation. Insofar as I have this feeling of a me inside, this sense of me is also haunted or shadowed by the sense of something wrong, something missing, something lacking. And here's where the real problem occurs. We don't normally understand the source of the problem. We know that something is missing, something isn't right, and what we tend to do, though, is we sort of turn it around and we look outside, conditioned not only by our own kind of personality, but also by the kind of culture that we grow up in, by the society that we're part of. We understand what it is we're lacking is something outside ourselves, something out here. And we learn, we grow up relating to other people, learning to want what they do, learning to understand our sense of lack in the way that they understand their sense of lack, right? So we learn, we identify certain ways. We think, if only I get enough of this out here, then I'll be okay. Then my sense of lack, this feeling of emptiness or insecurity at the very core of my being, then there's this possibility of filling it up. And of course, the reason I went through all of this at great length, I think you can see the point, is that to grow up in contemporary American society, I think we learn pretty quickly what it is that we lack. Right? I think, obviously, we don't have enough money. Or we don't have enough of the consumer toys that money can buy. And it's quite striking, some of the surveys I've read. You know, you can ask people of all different income levels, how much money would you need to be satisfied? And it seems to amount to 125% of whatever they already earn. It's always that much more. It's this notion, you know, it's never quite enough. And of course the tragedy here is that it never can be enough. Because the notion that if I can just get enough of this, and then it'll fill up my sense of lack, it'll make me feel more real, well, that in itself is a delusion. It's a misunderstanding. It's a symptom of the basic problem, which for Buddhism is the insubstantiality of this constructed, delusive sense of self. And it has to, for Buddhism, that has to be addressed at that level, you see. We have to do something that helps us get insight into the true nature of ourself, rather than somehow try to substantialize ourselves by grabbing on to something out here. So this is where I think we can see how the deeper Buddhist understanding of our situation can connect, especially in contemporary American society, with this preoccupation that we have with gaining money and also sort of consumerism. You could even say there's an almost perfect fit between the fundamental problem, or this way of understanding our basic problem according to Buddhism, and the kind of consumerism that we are all conditioned into, thinking that the next thing we buy is going to make us happy. And it always has to be the next thing, doesn't it? Because whatever we have might make us happy for a few minutes or so, but it's not going to last for very long. But it's not only the sense of self that's a construct. There's something else very important that's a construct here, and that is money itself. Money, capital, liquid assets. If you think about the money, think about the bills in your pocket, or think about the digits in your bank account, some bank computer. What's fascinating is that in and of themselves, they have no value whatsoever, right? Of what value is that piece of paper in your pocket? You can't eat it, ride in it, sleep under it. And if you want to burn it to keep warm, I'm not even sure they do burn anymore, but a newspaper would be a lot better. And it's obviously the same thing with the digits in the bank. We often say of someone who likes money that they're materialistic, but in fact it's really just the opposite. That what those digits, what those pieces of paper show us, is that money is a symbol system. A collectively, socially agreed, legally enforced symbol system. so that we can convert what is in itself the most worthless thing of all. This is the means by which we gain access to everything else that's valuable. And what's neat here, though, is that, again, let's go back to this sense of lack, this need to try to fulfill ourselves in some way by glomming onto something out here. What inevitably seems to happen is a kind of ends-means reversal. That money, for us, really becomes symbolic. I think it was Schopenhauer who said that money represents abstract happiness. Therefore, those who can't enjoy concrete happiness glom onto abstract happiness. But we can say it another way. We can say that money comes to symbolize for us the possibility of the satisfaction of every desire. And since the satisfaction of every desire is how we normally, in our culture, think about happiness, money ends up symbolizing the possibility of happiness, which helps us understand why it has that power, why that symbol has that power in our culture. What this reminds us of course, is the Midas story. And I don't know if you ever thought of it in this light. I think we're all familiar with the story of Midas, you know, the Greek myth, this very wealthy king who didn't have enough. According to the legend, he did a boon for the god Dionysus, or he did a favor for Dionysus, and the god Dionysus said, I'll give you whatever boon you want. And Midas said, I want the ability to transform whatever I touch into gold. And he had a great time transforming everything until it was time for dinner. Right? The food, the wine, ching, turns into gold. His daughter runs across the room. Ching, everything he touches turns into gold. I think this is a very profound myth, really pointing to the way that the ends-means reversal works in a way for all of us. Insofar as material things themselves can't actually ever fill up this sense of lack, we become preoccupied with the symbolism. I'm often fascinated that some women have this kind of compulsion to buy these incredibly expensive handbags. Right? What? $2,000, $3,000 handbags? It's really very strange until I realize, of course, they buy them not despite the fact that they're so expensive, but because they are so expensive, that the handbags symbolize something for them. Right? In our culture, where having lots of money and expensive things is what you value. That's how you make yourself feel more real. Then a woman walking down the street with a pretty expensive handbag, she feels some sort of, you know, I'm playing the game that everyone else is, and in a way I'm kind of winning it. I'm making myself feel more real. Not that we guys get away from this easily. I mean, I guess maybe a male equivalent would be some of our really expensive sports cars, right? I don't know what the top line car is these days. What, Maserati or something? Do they still make those? Right? But you know, when we buy something like a really, really expensive car, is it that we're fully enjoying the car because of this materiality? Often I would say not. I would say driving down the car, you know, not I'm the kind of guy that has a Maserati, you see? It's the same, it's the symbolic value, because in some way it's the symbolism that is going to, that's the collective game that we play in our society to somehow make ourselves feel more real. Does this make any sense? Excuse me a moment. Two more points. Curiously, I think the most interesting parallel in the Buddhist tradition for money is one of the most famous concepts, the concept of shunyata, which is usually translated as emptiness. Right? Emptiness is a way in the Buddhist tradition to in a shorthand way, point to the fact that nothing has any being of its own, that everything is a temporary manifestation, a way in which causes and conditions come together. For example, Thich Nhat Hanh made the point very well. A flower is made of non-flower elements. That is to say, in order to have a flower, you not only need a seed, you need the soil, you need the heat, you need the water, you need the sun. All of these things coming together are what actually create the flower. And that's true not only for the flower, but for everything else. But what's striking about shunyata, this sense of emptiness, is that there are two sides to it. In a way, by talking about lack, I've been talking about the negative side, the problematical side, about our own shunyata, our own lack of being. But as long as we experience this as a lack, as like a hole at the core of our being that we're trying to fill up, a kind of bottomless pit, there's something, it's experienced in kind of a negative way, this need, this compulsive need to substantialize ourselves in some way. But if we can somehow make friends with this hole, if we can learn to sit with it, not run away from it, as happens when we're meditating, for example, there can be a kind of a transformation, a turning around, a paravriti, and we can realize that this supposed hole at the core of our being is the place where there's infinite possibility, infinite transformation. That is to say, there's this possibility of, or this pure potentiality. And this is what the Buddhist tradition points to again, about realizing the true nature of our own mind. When there isn't this sense of lack inside us, that we're always, I've got to find something out here to hold on to kind of stabilize, secure myself. When we're not playing that game, then this emptiness at the core of our being becomes an incredible freedom, right? As it says in the Diamond Sutra, let the mind arise without fixing it anywhere. So the transformation from the glomming, from the attachment, to the freedom of a mind that doesn't need to do that, and therefore can dance, can play, can move from one thing to the other, can appreciate the world without getting stuck in the same way. That's a statement about shunyata, the true nature of our own minds, as well as the true nature of everything. And yet, it's fascinating, that's also a statement about the nature of money, isn't it? It's actually the true nature of money. Money, too, is also a nothing, empty in and of itself. But if we misunderstand it, if we think that money is somehow what we're going to use to make ourselves more real, we can never have enough. But when we're no longer trapped playing that game, then money can be something that's extremely valuable, it can be a very important part of the Bodhisattva path for those who have the wealth. You see, if they're not attached to it, they can use in valuable ways, which is precisely, of course, what the Buddhist tradition is talking about. But let me finish now. We're getting to the green goo. What I maybe didn't emphasize enough yet is the fact that, but I think it's implied in what I was saying, that money itself is not wealth. Money is just empty pieces of paper that we have socially agreed we can transform into wealth. We've agreed that with the money, I will take your money and give you something of value. Food, car, house, education, whatever. So money isn't wealth. Money symbolizes the possibility of wealth. Money symbolizes our collectively, socially agreed ability to get access to all of the valuable things. Not only food and so forth, but you can say all the natural resources, all the cultural resources. Money is a kind of accounting device, and that brings us to the green goo. Gray goo, not green goo, but gray goo, is something that nanotechnologists sometimes talk about. It's a kind of hypothetical end-of-the-world scenario where there's this concern, maybe nanotechnologists will make these self-replicating tiny, tiny robots that might get out of control. And you might have a little robot that is designed to sort of transform chlorophyll into something else. And given that they're self-replicating, if they get outside the library into the environment, you might have this horrible disaster where the whole Earth was being transformed into a gray goo. We couldn't control these self-replicating robots, right? This is a scenario known as ecophagy, literally eating the ecology, eating the biosphere, coined by the nanotech pioneer Eric Drexler way back in '86, saying that we can't afford certain types of accidents. That would be the end. I mean, we definitely can't afford that kind of accident. But I wonder if that way of looking at it misses a somewhat slower accident that's been going on already, which I want to describe with the green goo. What I mean by this is a kind of irony. Remembering that money in itself is a nothing, that can become anything. And that what goes on in the economic process, of course, say with a corporation, the idea is you have a certain amount of expenditure and you want to have more income than outgo, and that's the profit, and that's the capital, and that's the money. And yet, in the process of doing it, what we so often see happening, in addition to many wonderful things, but we also look at what's going on in the environment. We look at what's happening to the mountaintops in Kentucky, or what's happening to the boreal forests up in northern Alberta, Canada, that are being destroyed in order to grab the tar sands, right? Or what's happening to the oceans that are being fished out, or what's happening to the topsoil that's disappearing, or what's happening to the air in places like Beijing where you literally can't breathe it anymore, right? So you can see maybe what I'm getting at here, that in the economic process, in order to maximize the profit, that is to say, the capital, the nothing, that only has value insofar as you can convert it into something of real value, something ultimately that comes from the natural world. In order to maximize this nothing, this vision I have is that we're destroying everything. That is to say, the mountain, I'm exaggerating here, but you can see what I'm pointing to. We're destroying everything of real value, that's real wealth. The forest, the air, the oceans, the rivers, etc. We're in danger of destroying or polluting all this real wealth, everything, in order to maximize something that is nothing, that only has value insofar as we can convert it into something else. And yet the hypothetical scenario here I'm suggesting is the possibility that we might end up with a world where we all have trillions of dollars, and yet the things that we would like it to exchange it for have been destroyed. And it just occurs to me that when we think about greed, ill will, and delusion, that's about as horrifying an example of collective greed as frightening an example of collective aggression against the natural world, and also as sort of frightening an example of sort of collective delusion as I can think of. Thank you very much.